Fab Filippo is an actor, screenwriter, and playwright. Most recently, he co-created, wrote, and directed the critically acclaimed comedy drama Sort of for CBC and HBO Max. A winner of a slew of awards, Sort of is the main focus here, but Fab has also worked on a huge array of shows and films over the years, from his work writing and directing Save Me to co-writing the true crime indie film Perfect Sisters. Gray Powell has worked all over Canada with various theatre companies, but has spent the most time acting at the Shaw Festival, where he is a festival star. His most recent film and television credits include Hudson and Rex, Designated Survivor, Murdoch Mysteries, and the Netflix film Arc. My conversation with Fab and Gray grew out of an article that I just wrote for CBC that focuses on this fantastic show, Sort of, a series focused on the character of Sabi, played so captivatingly by Bilal Baig, who is also the show's co-creator, executive producer, and writer. My article talks about my experience as the father of a transgender kid in the 21st century, and about how the show challenges us as caregivers to consider the emotional labor that kids, and especially gender non-conforming kids, often have to do to support their parents. In one part of the piece, I call the show a careful study of the gendered politics of caregiving that uses humor to explore the idea that our ability to properly see others comes from combining humility and self-awareness with love. So clearly the show has really caused me to think about some of my own ideas around gender and identity. It's remarkable, I think, for the ways that it does this through subtle storytelling rather than by being didactic or preachy. And this is one of the things that we talk about a lot in this conversation. How does a show that's built in part out of the parameters of trying to find arts funding in Canada create a tone that is gentle and subtle without losing its edge or abandoning its radical commitment to honesty, gender and racial inclusion, intersectionality, and queer love? Fab jokes here that he doesn't think Canada invented subtlety or gentleness in storytelling, but senses that one defining feature of the new Canadian flourishing of progressive television might be an interest in cross-sectionality. So as a white, cisgender, hetero dad, I felt most seen or maybe implicated by the depiction of Paul, played by Gray, who, alongside his partner Bessie, played by Grace Lynn Kung, employs Sabi as a nanny for his two kids, Violet and Henry. Fab has spoken before about how developing the character of Paul was important to honing the show's voice and direction, and one moment that we keep coming back to here is a particularly moving scene shot for season 2 of the show, which debuts on November 15th, by the way, on CBC Gem. In the scene, Paul gets home after a very difficult day, and as Gray puts it, he just needs a moment of emotional release. Despite not being able to find the right register in the moment, Gray says that he had to push himself as an actor because of time constraints, and the result is, in Fab's words, an awe-inspiring demonstration of what Gray is capable of as an actor. But the scene's also just as much an example of the vision and skill set that Fab brings as a director and showrunner. I'll mention too that at a couple of points here, Fab talks about how he's thrilled by the existence of this interview with Gray because of the original genesis of Sort of, to make a show about how each of us is going through transitions and about how not all transitions are alike. The three of us talk about what it means to try to constantly learn and be humble as dads, to negotiate ego and be adaptable to situations. I think Fab's point is well taken here. He reminds us that, quote, you cannot engineer your child. Just like as an artist they have to let go of perfectionism, being a parent means relinquishing control of your kids and giving them, as the show puts it, room to be new. The result with Sort of is a show where every character has a distinct voice and 3 dimensions. The humor feels organic, and yet the overall tone feels cohesive. It's a rare feat, and one accomplished, they say, by creating a creative environment that respects difference and that seeks difference. And yeah, so I am writing this piece for CBC that tries to reflect on my own experience as a father of a transgender tween and a non-binary teen. Both, relatively new developments in our experience as a family. So it's a show that's meant a lot to me. So first of all, thanks for making it. It's a tremendous thing that you've created.
Thank you for watching it and for also being open to, the show and your children.
Yeah, it honestly has meant a lot, and obviously it means a lot to a lot of people. Like this is obviously the power of I guess like not just storytelling, but in some ways like storytelling in a digital medium, which can reach so many people. So sort of is a show that has obviously moved audiences, but it's like also a show that has won a number of awards. It's won, a Peabody. It's won Canadian Screen Actor Awards for Best Comedy, Best Writing, Members' Choice Series Ensemble Award, all kinds of awards. And it's like interesting to think about a show in almost like the wake of Schitt's Creek in Canada receiving this much acclaim. Like Canada is obviously there's this incredible like flourishing of creative talent, but it's misunderstood in I think some ways. And this is sort of where I wanted to start was sort of by thinking about the like Canadianness of this show, because I think that's kind of what's interesting about it. It's not especially stereotypically Canadian, and yet I read a review in NPR by John Powers about the show, and I want to quote a piece of that review to kind of frame this question. He says, and I have issues with this. He says, whatever radicalism sort of possesses is quiet, so quiet that some viewers may find it too tame, too, dare I say it, Canadian. The show takes issues that are often used as hot buttons, trans life, racial difference, interracial relationships, and with decent good sense treats them as an everyday, often funny part of life. What I think this misses is like the complicated relationship of the characters on the show with Canada. Seven returns from Germany in the first season and is, asked like why she's in Canada. And she says like, why is anyone in Canada? In the new season, Seven has this joke about like how the only context in which it's okay to listen to Canadian alt rock is like when you're going to the cottage. And yet it is sort of like set in Toronto. It's situated in a way that has this kind of restless relationship to Canada and sort of Canadian cultural norms. So Gray, you've talked about, for example, how you feel like sort of offers people an invitation to identify with the humanity and complexity of all the communities represented. Was part of the point, and this is to both of you, to sort of take the risk of challenging viewers who might expect a kind of homogeneous Canadianness from their TV to realize that there is like a radical diversity of people and perspectives in this country.
I'll stick to my lane in terms of just speaking from as an actor. I speak to being a dad outside of being an actor and sort of the character of Paul. But in terms of approaching it, it all comes, as an actor, it comes from the writing. And so the complexities that are in there in terms of approaching it, it just is, it seemed from the writing and from the spirit of what the show is, that everyone, as the show talks about, is that life in transition, that the intersectionality of just where people are at that time, where Paul is at that time, and reacting to the situations that are confronting him at that time, be it within the family, be it with negotiating with Subby, being it with negotiating just his own life in general. So, and where his kids are growing. And where he's meeting them at that moment. And I think the inherent complexities of that, I never thought about sort of where we were, whether we were in Canada, Toronto, and how that affected it. It was just, how's he dealing with each moment as it comes? Does that make sense?
I think it does.
So everything else. So I assume everything, so then that's the micro, that's the minutia. And then everything resonates from there because of, and I put it on the writing, that the writing was so human in that sense. It was honest in each situation, that nothing was ever treated as token moments. Nothing was ever treated as we really want to hammer this point home, that this is important for all to listen to. It was all just in the minutia of the relationships. Fab's biggest thing was just, let's just be real, honest, and talk to each other in these moments. And I, as an actor, I feel like those are the moments that then that's what gives the ripples in the pond that then go out. And then people take on what they will.
I love that thing about like focusing on the micro, not the macro, not, Canada writ large, but these people's experience of maybe existing in this culture. Whereas Seven says at one point, it is a bit of like a cisgender dystopia in some ways, still like a bit of a closed-minded culture, but it's not it's never preachy. It's about the specific character's kind of granular experience of life on the ground, as it were.
And Paul's only experience is dealing. He comes at life through a fairly binary sensibility, and he is cis and binary. That's not him trying to be cis. That's just who he is. I mean, Fab, you might have something that's more profound on the bigger sort of creative level and what the message was. But from my lane, that was at least I couldn't, if I had thought about how the bigness of it and how it would resonate, my brain would blow up.
I mean, I think it's an amazing question. This idea of like how Canadian is this show, and I've heard a number of reviews, usually American, attributing the sort of gentleness of the show to a kind of Canadianness, and I'm like, I don't know if Canada invented like subtlety in storytelling, but okay. On the other hand, as an artist, we are always, because of the way we fund stuff in our country, we're always trying to fall into a category of Canadianness. And what is the definition of Canadian? We've definitely, when we were shopping it, we're told that the show wasn't Canadian enough, and I've had like many things that I've made that weren't Canadian enough. And so, what does that mean?
Yeah. What does that mean? Exactly.
Weird, right? I mean, Bilal and I really, when we came together to make this show, we wanted to represent the cross-sectionality of existing in Toronto. This is how I grew up. This is what it looked like, and I think what makes the show, frankly, more Canadian than, your average kind of American show is not really the subtlety or the quote gentleness of the show, but it's the cross-sectionality of the show. Usually an American show is African-American or South Asian, or, usually shows are sort of one thing, This show isn't one thing. This show's frankly not even like entirely queer, It's a queer show, but it's also a show about family, like you said, and it's also a show about, brownness, and it's also a show about like being in this world and being a cis white male and trying to find your place in it. And it really does live up to the name, sort of, because it's like, even genre wise, it's like, is it a drama? Is it a comedy? Sort of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think a lot about the title of the show, honestly. And it reminds me of Frances Ha, that wonderful Greta Gerwig film. And how like the kind of title metaphor of that film is unfinishedness. You don't see her full name. That idea of like not seeing someone's full name, not having it all figured out. And that is in some ways distinct from the show that I mentioned, and we won't, necessarily spend too much time on Schitt's Creek, but it's funny that like that show, I think, casts a sort of, not a shadow, but it has this like powerful influence on sort of, as it were, queer storytelling, what's allowable, what's imaginable. It pushed things forward in certain ways, but as Billy Eichner's character in Bros points out, it also is so gentle that it kind of loses a little bit of edge to some extent, but strategically, right? To just achieve some kind of, like progress through storytelling. And like, this is to me what is so wonderful about Sort of, is it like, it kind of catapults it forward. And from what I understand, like the genesis of the show is that, you presented Fab, the idea of this show, to Bilal based on their experiences, and that they, basically put it to you that there wasn't an obvious reason for you to be involved in the creation of a show, like built around that. And you've said like a few times that was like a really important moment for you, kind of gut check moment where you got to a kind of place though through that where you could kind of create the series together. And, Bilal has said in interviews that there was something, quote, about hearing a cis person use the word transition casually that was really powerful for them. So I know you've spoken this elsewhere, but I'm wondering what was important and maybe remains important going into releasing the second season about that initial challenge for you. Like, how was, making Sort of a way of having an opportunity for you to process some of the stuff that like you were going through when the idea began to gestate, and how do you see it kind of coming into some sort of fruition in season 2?
I mean, if I could just say, first of all, like one of the reasons I'm thrilled by just the existence of this interview with Gray and I, because the secondary thing after Bilal sort of laid down that challenge of like, why would I make this show with you? I went off to think about it and presented them this idea that we would make a show that was cross-sectional and about transition, like for everybody. Mm-hmm. And how it looked in the world, because not all transitions are alike. And then Bilal said, well, if I'm me in the show, who are you? and Gray Powell's here, and Gray, you're me, just so you know. I don't know if you knew that.
No pressure.
That's why I'm so on you, about looking handsome all the time. I don't know.
That's right. Yeah.
Great haircut in season 2. Great haircut. Yeah.
Look, it's a good question. I think that season 1 was really about just being seen. If you're going to sort of look at an ultimate sort of theme for the season, like the overarching theme of the show is transition, but like, season 1 was just Subby being seen. And so I think the next step is, then being loved and loving and being able to experience all the different kinds of love that come with, finally accepting yourself. And I think it starts with this kind of notion that there's a reference to, Subby wanting a kind of love that's like a Rachel McAdams love, and then we just watched real love like be a lot more complicated than that.
This is the thing, Fab, you've mentioned elsewhere that all the actors on the show this like level of vulnerability when you're creating the series, like this element of play. And there are like, I think these two powerful qualities that you're like clearly working through here, which is vulnerability, but also like accountability. That love is about like kind of both things for this show. So CBC sent me a press kit that to me was unlike any press kit I think I've ever seen, that has this like really moving articulation of accountability. It says, accountability involves self-reflection, flexibility, humility, integrity, communication, and emotional regulation. I was like, yes, this makes sense for a show that is about how to properly see others and about like combining humility and self-awareness with love. So as I mentioned, I'm the father in a family with one transgender person, one non-binary person. And to me, like the show's focus on how transition is like it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's always supported by a community was like really moving in terms of like trying to work through these ideas. And I guess I wondered like how much awareness of that feeling of like support and community is going into the show. I know Bilal has said like, there's a real desire to depict just warmth in a cold world. It's not about trying to be a Canadian show in terms of like the tenderness. It's about yearning for warmth. Like how much of the emotionality of the writing is conscious and deliberate in those ways, and how much of it is just like organic and intuitive about kind of like play.
What was interesting for me as a writer, I started out with much harder lines going in. And it was actually Bilal who, at one point, I do remember this moment where we were writing early on before we even had a green light, where Bilal looked at a scene that I had written and went, well, that's kind of mean. And I was like, that's mean? I didn't even know that was mean. I just thought that was funny, and
Interesting.
And then like how much humor, like, and this is us coming out of that weird sort of like, era of like cringe humor and the comedy of ridicule and we did both write characters that you would just love to hate, and then once we did that, we then three-dimensionalized those characters and went,
right.
If you can't understand where a character is coming from, if you don't get it, then we haven't done our job, and it doesn't mean taking the edge off of the character. There was a lot of struggle with Paul, for instance, because,
sure.
Paul was really kicking and screaming his way through experiencing the potential possible loss of his partner in season 1. And it came out in the way that it's usually allowed to come out with men, and cis men, particularly in a culture like ours, which is in anger, through anger and rage. And so, we were very careful, because it was like, oh God, Paul kind of seems like a monster. We just really got to figure out how to really feel where he's coming from. And I'm very excited about his journey, particularly in terms of season 2 and seeing what he goes through.
Mm-hmm. And from that perspective as well, it's hard on that point. It's tough in a 23-minute episodic journey in one season to sort of, because it is a long game. You're hoping that the audience will stay with you in that struggle and how it manifests itself in that struggle, because it does need to go through stages. So yes, hopefully they stay with us, because he does go through that next stage, as do all the characters have their own. I think there's lots of different openings and breaking opens of how they respond to their various transitions in their lives. I was going to add, and I'm not sure if this is answering the question, but adding or answering or taking away from the question. But the idea too of this notion, or you were talking about how it's we're raised by the community, is there was so much involved in creating a space, not just in the writing, but also just on set. Programs like intern programs for transgendered youth to come in and sort of shadow and be an apprentice on set. And just having visibility and being a part of it, just the way that Bilal and Fab and the producers have kind of engaged in creating just an environment I'm not sure if it's, if you could, or quantifying how we all, how the tone of the show or which was created first, whether it was the tone of the show or the tone of the environment. Because the set is the set, because Bilal is Bilal, because Fab is Fab, because the producers are the producers, everyone just kind of starts to fill in and figure out and open up, and it's much more soft, I guess, in that way.
Well, you've created like an environment for creativity with so much care. It sounds like, Fab, I've heard you talk about like the learning curve of like managing a writer's room, and how like you had to, think really carefully about your relationship with that environment, like working with writers. I think it's in your Creative Company interview that you talk about like how to, really consciously take seriously, I guess, the responsibility of doing that kind of managerial work. And you said like Bilal, it's just like, because of their experience working in a community and mentoring young trans folks, like it just kind of comes naturally to them. Whereas like for you, it is a little bit more of like a process, since Gray kind of invoked it. What can you speak to that, to the trans mentorship program and like its significance going into the second season and maybe the third?
Yeah, I mean, I also want to talk about that notion of caring about management in a particular way, and it's both generational and both the lens that we have on the world, because, like what's interesting is like, there's this belief somewhere that both, I think Gray was probably raised with too in the arts, where it's like, it's not a democracy. There has to be a dictator. And then you have to be kind of hard with people to get what you want. And it's a myth. It's really a myth. And it's sort of shaking that is, because show running is really like, oh my God, it's such a crazy thing to do. It's, you're really just riding it more than you are controlling it, and once you get used to that and you open that up, like, there was an actor who came in who I was giving a kind of direction to, and I could tell they were just not able to nail it. And I, instead of kind of doing what like my first instinct was, which was try to get them to do what I wanted them to do, I went up and I said, hey, my direction is not resonating with you. Can you, like, how are you feeling about that? And they're like, well, I don't think that's the way that I should do the scene. And I'm like, oh my God, then how do you think you should do the scene? And they had like an equally great take on it. And I was like, well, let's do that, and it was really thrilling for me, because that's when you bring in that sort of unsayable thing. You're monitoring what everybody's bringing. And sort of to go into sort of like the mentorship program. I mean, it was incredible to have people get their first exposure to something that they want to be doing, that in a lot of cases ended up in actually being hired.
That's so great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the people who ran the program were amazing. And it was thrilling to see them then go to work,
And I mean, like, it speaks to kind of what Gray was talking about in terms of like the difference between a kind of superficial appeal to diversity and something that is deeper, that is like in the DNA of a show. It's obviously the case that there's still like a deep level of, let's call it what it is, like systemic discrimination against trans and non-binary folks at the level of like the industry. So I think like making those moves to materially change the conditions basically of like creating culture is amazing. But so just to kind of loop back to something you were saying earlier about like Fab, like writing lines that felt mean and trying to sort of like develop characters that are more sympathetic. Like Paul in some ways could be a character who you love to hate. Like there are moments where he is kind of unsympathetic. He says things that are abrasive, and yet the audience, if you stick around, as Gray was saying, and kind of play the long game and have a degree of patience, Paul becomes increasingly sympathetic, I would say. And this is the thing, like for me as a viewer, as a cisgender hetero father, like I feel most seen in some sense, or maybe like more accurately implicated by the show's depiction of Paul. But I guess I wanted to ask about the specific ways that you generate sympathy in the audience for Paul, both as a writer and as a performer. Like, this is the idea, is that like, there's a moment where Sabi says to Paul that he should stop treating others like they're an extra in his movie. One of the early episodes of the new season ends with this like emotional gut punch of a scene that is scored beautifully by Moses Sumney's song Plastic. Gray, your choices in that scene are like amazing to me. Acting is this mystifying art for a lot of people, myself included. What Paul is doing is clearly trying to hold back emotion that he cannot hold back. And it seems like you're trying to perform that like gendered thing of like trying to do that, like hold it back, to restrain emotion, but he can't. And I guess like, how did you think about approaching that moment in that hallway where Paul can no longer pretend he isn't broken?
This is a good question. I haven't seen any of the screeners yet, so I'm assuming you mean a moment coming home. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to be honest, if we go into the weeds, that was actually a frustrating one. I could tell you what I was hoping. What I could tell you what was on the page, and what I wanted to, and then what was, as with anything on set, anything can happen. We shot that at the end of the day, and there wasn't much time. I knew on an intellectual level what it was, that he was just, there were things happening in Paul's life, some information that, he's just kind of trying to process. He doesn't know how. It's one of those moments where he just needed a release, essentially. Mm-hmm. It's just everything has been bottled. So to get there, I was listening to this song over and over again that I had really sort of was able to take me somewhere that had moved me, and but it wasn't moving me on that day. It just wasn't. There was just things were happening, and I couldn't get in. For Paul, it was a moment of release, and that's what had to happen. That he just couldn't contain himself, and that he didn't want anyone else to see. It was what he thought was he's hoping is a solitary moment, and it's and then as an actor, it was a moment of tension, because it was fast, and it was end of day, and it was trying to get to a place that I didn't think I'd got to a place in performance. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and look, and just quickly from my point of view, it's amazing that you say that, and because I've been an actor before, and you want to feel it, but oftentimes when you don't feel it, it's really good. And what first of all, like I think what Gray was able to pull out there when he says we didn't have a lot of time, it was really run and gun that moment. It was really like he's underplaying like the level of emotion he was able to achieve with the sort of like not enough preparation, and I was kind of in awe of it, to be honest. But at the same time, I knew that he wasn't feeling it, and because I had been there before. I was able to kind of just like, and what's great about getting to direct and being one of the showrunners is that that you can see this moment through to the very end of post-production, and a lot of directors don't have that privilege or ability to go, don't worry, I got you. And I'm going to this is going to work. I know this is going to work. I know what music we're going to put over, all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I think that is an example of a kind of vulnerability where we were trusting each other quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's the biggest thing, is the trust. And Fab is very clear about when he gets what he gets, he's got it, and he'll let you know. And if he hasn't got it, we won't move on. And so that relationship is wonderful because it's honest and then he can patch stuff up in post.
Yeah.
That's all, by the way, that was all CGI, that performance.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. You can't tell. It's amazing.
It's amazing, right? What we can do now.
Yeah.